All right, almost there. All right, it's 6:30 according to my screen. And we'll go with that. I know we're already streaming, so that's it. But good evening, everybody, and welcome to the March 2nd work session of the Town Council. We're pleased to have everybody here with us. We're pleased for those who are joining us online and those who are watching and those who will watch later. So we're glad to have everyone involved. For people in the audience, this is a work session. So if we have time at the end of the meeting, we reserve 10 minutes for public comment, but council never votes at a work session. We have discussion about something and all items come back for a regular council meeting if they're to be voted on. So just to remind you with that, public is also encouraged to email us or call. There are other ways of connecting with council members via talking to us different ways. In keeping with our virtual rules, though, we do need to do a roll call. So as I call your name, if you will please unmute yourself and let us know you're here. Normally, we are a little more informal at council meetings, but in order to get your names recorded, I will be calling your last name for the roll call. So Mayor Pro Tem Karen Stegman.
Here.
Councilmember Jess Anderson.
Here.
Councilmember Camille Berry.
Here.
Councilmember Ty Wynn.
Her.
Councilmember Paris Miller-Fushi.
Here.
Councilmember Michael Parker.
Here.
Councilmember Amy Ryan.
Here.
Councilmember Adam Searing.
Here.
And the mayor is here also. So, before we get started, I do have a few announcements. Sorry. Just want to share that the Council Committee on Economic Sustainability will meet this coming Friday, March 4th from 8 to 10 a.m. It will be virtual, just to remind you. Our next council meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, March 9th at 7 p.m., also virtual. And it was announced yesterday that the Orange County leaders are looking at modifying the mask mandate. If our numbers keep tracking the same way, we would lift the mask mandate on Monday, March 7th. I do know it's been a little confusing for folks. The CDC data lags behind the data that we have here real time. And we have some different data from UNC hospitals as far as how many Orange County residents are taking up beds versus other folks. So our data is a little different than what's reported, and I know that's confusing. But this means we're going to be trying to come back to a more normal routine and meeting together. But Maurice, the manager, and I are working on what that looks like. And I've reached out to all of you. I'm pretty sure we are staying virtual through the end of March. And if the numbers continue to stay in those negative trends, then we will be back in person the 1st of April at Town Hall. So just to let you know that. Okay. Are there any other announcements from council members? I'll just share one more thing. We had an inner city planning meeting today with the chamber. The inner city visit is something that usually happens every 2 years, but because of COVID, we didn't go when we were supposed to go in 2020. There was a little bit of discussion about where we were going and whether we wanted to take the risk of flying far away. So it'll probably be something more local, but I won't share what the thinking is with that because it could change. But that we are looking at a Thursday through a Saturday in late October. I encourage council members to, when we have the dates finalized, to look at that. It's an important thing. It provides a lot of good discussion and a lot of good visuals of how other places do things that we're looking to do. And it's a great way to connect and meet and just get out of town for a little bit and think about some things differently. I'll send out more information later, but I just wanted to let you know that that would be coming up in October. Paris.
Yeah, quickly, I just wanted to recognize that March 1st was the first day of Women's History Month. And so happy Women's History Month. And just want to say thank you to all those women, past and present, for all of their sacrifice and hard work. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just going to mention too, a couple of you have blurred backgrounds. I think Camille and Paris. It's very hard to see the raised hand in the blurred backgrounds. If I don't call on you, if you'll just wave at me. I know we're still all learning the Zoom world, but I've noticed that I had a hard time seeing it last time and I meant to remark on that. Okay, so this evening I want to talk about what we're doing. This is a work session and we're continuing our discussion about the redevelopment possibilities of the police station property at 828 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. And before I introduce the presenters, I'd like to just share what the process is going to be for the audience and to make sure that we're on the same page for what we're actually discussing this evening. The town has been going through this process for 8 years. I've been going through it for 6, so quite aware of the different things. And we've reached a point where we need to decide what a next step will be. Do we move forward? But we've got to take some energy, and we've gone through 3 different iterations of council during this process too. So I know that newer members who come on board have had to learn, and we've given lots of opportunities to help those newer members learn. We've had small group sessions, we've had information sessions, we've had it at council meetings, we've had it at CCS meetings. So I just wanted to point out that I know this is it's a big decision, it's a difficult, but it's an important decision, and there's a lot of technical information, and we've had a lot of opportunities for that input, but we also hired experts in the fields to help give us that information so that we weren't just relying on our own research. We've also set up a website that people can explore all the information that's been put out there. It's been out there since July of 2013. And so tonight's focus is on the Memorandum of Understanding, or we call it an MOU, with Belmont Sayer, a firm that was chosen through an RFQ process because of their experience with brownfields. And I just want to say there's 3 things to highlight. An MOU is non-binding, which means either party can back out at either time. Second, entering into an MOU will allow us to engage more fully with the Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ's, brownfields program to better understand what it would take to make this site safe for everyone, regardless of how we decide the land should be used. Public and environmental safety are our #1 goals. And third, even though we're talking about the possible future uses for the site, the MOU process does not result in a project of approval or a rezoning. Any proposed project that emerges out of all these conversations will need to go through the town's extensive development review process. So an MOU, non-binding, more information, and still have to go through all of the town's process. So, and I want everyone to know this is a decision the town takes very seriously. And with all that said, I will turn it over to our experts who are going to share with us. Laura, are you introducing them for us this evening?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With us this evening, my name, Laura Selmer. I'm with the Economic Development Department. With us tonight, we have Keith Johnson, our outside legal counsel on the project. We also have 2 folks from our Hart and Hickman team. We have Steve Hart and Justin Ballard with us. And our Belmont team, we have Ken Ryder, Mark Mosier, and John Gallagher. And with that, I will share my screen.
Laura, could you say a little bit more about who the experts really are and what they're
Yeah, I believe Keith will be going into his qualifications and experience.
Good, okay.
But I'll just note that Hart and Hickman are our environmental engineers. They're all certified engineers. They've been working with us for several years on this project, so they know an awful lot about the history, the sampling we've done, the reports we've done. So we're very grateful to have them. Okay. This information may be a little redundant, but for anyone new to the conversation, I want to just reiterate the timeline. In the 1960s and 70s, construction debris and coal combustion products were placed on the property. It was previously used as a borrow pit and then filled in with this material as structural fill. In the 1980s, the town acquired the property and constructed the current police building. In 2013, the coal ash was discovered on the property, and for the subsequent years, we studied the site. We conducted a phase 1 and phase 2 remedial investigation. We knew that the police needed to be in a new space, so we've worked with our police department in gathering information about what that would look like. And then 2019, we conducted the interim remedial measures. Those were intended to be temporary measures to stabilize the bank and clean up the trail. Those were not required by DEQ. Those were additional measures the town elected to undertake in prioritizing our public safety. While the trail was being redeveloped, we combined those efforts to remove the coal ash from that area. As the mayor mentioned, we followed an RFQ process. This RFQ was issued in December of 2020. So we have been working with Belmont Sayer for a year now on this phase of the project. And they were selected based on their experience with the Brownfield program. They're also local developers. And with that, I will hand things over to Keith Johnson.
Great. Thank you, Laura. As was mentioned, I appreciate the introduction. I'm Keith Johnson with Pointer Spruill here in Raleigh. I'm an environmental attorney, been practicing here in Raleigh for over 30 years, and I've been and am environmental counsel to the town regarding the site. My first involvement with this site was when the coal ash was first discovered in 2013. My background includes various brownfields projects for other cities, City of Raleigh, Raleigh Civic Center, multiple sites in downtown Fayetteville. I've also dealt with brownfield sites that were redeveloped for a variety of purposes, including residential purposes, one here in Raleigh. And I'm also familiar with, besides the brownfields program, the other voluntary environmental programs under state law by which sites with some environmental impairment can be addressed. Now, there are two products that we've got for you tonight. One is a pretty short PowerPoint, which we're going to go through. You'll see it's got my firm logo on it. It's got Hart and Hickman. The point there is this is a joint project. We're going to be addressing some technical subjects that are outside of my legal expertise. And I will be turning to Steve and his team or the folks with Belmont that are in here on the call tonight to answer any questions that go toward more technical matters. So this is sort of a joint presentation to you all. I'm just going to try to play the coordinator here. The other product that we produce for you all, my firm and the Hart and Hickman, is a fact sheet, and it's a short little fact sheet that was put together primarily to answer a number of the questions that you all have posed and that have come from the public since last fall when the last risk assessment was done by Hart and Hickman. So remember that fact sheet and I refer it to you. So like I said, this is not going to be long. I know it's a work session, so I'm happy to stop and we will entertain questions as we go. Of course, we'll answer any questions when we're finished as well. I'm going to cover 4 topics. And again, these are really coming out of the various questions that have been raised since last fall. The first is to sort of revisit what we call the cap and contain approach to addressing the existence of the coal ash fill on this site. What does that look like? What does that mean? That'll be the first thing. The second is I want to contrast a site like this where you have upland coal ash fill, very common, with a coal ash slurry impoundment near an electric utility plant. 2 very different things. And I'm going to talk about the differences between those. That's important. Third, I want to talk about the Brownfields program. A number of the questions that have been raised have been about the Brownfields program. And there are 2 primary things I want to hit on the Brownfields program. First, by law, by state law, the site must be made safe for reuse under the Brownfields program, whatever that reuse looks like. It's not a shortcut for addressing the conditions on the site by any means. And then secondly, I want to go through, there've been a number of questions about, okay, well, I understand the cost and cap approach to redeveloping the site. Well, what assurances are in place that those measures will be in place and will be sound 30 years from now, 40 years from now? There's some unique measures that go towards that under the Brownfields program, and I want to address those as well. And then the final thing I want to do is just address the schedule, and the mayor sort of laid the groundwork for that, made that easy for me, but I want to hit the schedule, talk about where we are in the, let's say, the entitlement process. So Laura, if you want to go to the next slide. So the first topic I want to talk about is the cap and contain approach that's being contemplated here. And, you know, the point here, first point, this site absolutely can be redeveloped and made safe for reuse. So let's talk about how. Laura, if you go to the next slide, let's call this the proposed approach. Cap and contain. What does that mean? I've got on this slide the elements that are involved in that. Some amount of the coal ash fill will be removed and sent for proper offsite disposal. The exact amount and the exact locations of where that will take place are to be determined, but there will be some removal of coal ash fill in order to create the cap that we're going to talk about. On the surface of the site, let's talk about the upland part of the site primarily. The surface of the site would be capped with impervious surface, buildings, pavement, sidewalks, and where there is no impervious surface, 3 to 4 feet of clean fill. It is a given that part of the approach to cap and contain here, and this gets to the contain part, is there will be a retaining wall that will have to be built between the upland and the down gradient part of the site in light of the severe slope, which is where, to the extent there is any, let's call daylighted fill, it's in that slope that goes down to the creek. So that's one of the elements of cap and contain. And the final one is to restrict the use of the groundwater on the site by a permanent deed restriction. So this is basically the essence of the approach. It's not a novel approach. It's a very common approach to sites with some environmental impairment. Let's go to the next slide, Laura. So to illustrate this, we gave you this, this diagram, and you see what I'm talking about. And the buildings and what you see on the surface there is just for illustrative purposes. But the potential risk are addressed by limited soil excavation and removal, capping areas with clean soil, buildings, pavements, and the retaining wall. Let me also say that by taking this approach and redeveloping the site, the stormwater management on the site will be also improved over the current stormwater management measures. Okay, if we go to the next slide, Laura. So the approach here on cap and contain, the result, the objective is to address all human exposure to coal ash, fill, and debris. In other words, you put in place a cap and contain so that short of some catastrophic event, act of God, a rogue utility contractor, there will be, should not be, any human interaction with the coal ash fill. That objective is what is required by law. Well, let me back up. That is what would be required by the Brownfields group at DEQ. That's what they're going to expect, is that they need to see a design for redevelopment of the site that achieves that objective. So let's talk for a few minutes about the risk assessment for the upland portion that the town had Hart and Hickman do last fall, which reasonably so has spurred, a number of questions. Okay, what did that risk assessment tell us, and what does it not tell us? That's really what I want to touch on. That assessment shows that there's no unacceptable health risk to the current use of the upland portion of the property where the police quarters is located. The assessment then addresses what risks are involved for hypothetical future uses of the property under, and this is the key, under its current conditions, including that some coal ash is currently exposed along that steep bank towards the creek that I mentioned. What has, I think, been lost in this discussion is the property will not be repurposed in its current conditions. So those daylighted conditions of some coal ash fill in that slope, it's not going to be left as is. So all the questions, some of the questions about what risk is posed by future use of the site under its current conditions, I'll submit to you is academic, because that's not the way the site's going to be redeveloped. The pertinent questions are this: will all human exposure to coal ash debris be addressed under any redevelopment scenario? And two, what are the means that'll be taken to ensure that the cap and contain measures that I mentioned before remain in place over time, over the decades, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. And that's with regard to both the upland portion of the site and down in the Greenway, where the town has already taken some interim remedial measures. So let's just focus for a second on, okay, well, cap and contain. Okay, I understand that. What are the other options for the town to address this site? Well, you could leave it as is and put a fence around it and just essentially create a donut hole in your urban landscape that's not producing, any income. That's actually, from an environmental perspective, less advantageous to redeveloping it, because it's just going to sit as is. You're not going to do that. Well, what about removal of all of the coal ash and transportation to a disposal facility and then replaced with clean fill? Some of you, I know, have already heard this before, but for those that are new, it may be helpful to touch on this, and we touched on it in the fact sheet. All right, technically, you could do that, perhaps. But as a practical matter, in my opinion, no. It would be at a significant financial cost, not only financially to the town, but also potentially to the environment. You're almost causing, under that scenario, more harm than good because of the risk of exposure during the excavation. Estimates are, and the staff has looked at this, you're talking about over 5,000 truck trips to the nearest facility is 40 miles away, but it can't take this volume. You're looking at a financial estimate of that, let's call it full removal, in the range of 13 to 16 million. Compared to the projected cost of cap and contain of somewhere between 3 and 5. If the decision was made, let's just remove all of it. We don't care about the 5,000 trips. We'll take the risk of the exposure during excavation. You're not going to get any financial help for that. And I can tell you that the regulators at DEQ are not going to be very enthusiastic about it either. So This might be a good place before I go to the next topic for me to stop, see if there are any questions.
I can't see the whole screen, so I'm sorry. I have to sort of go through. I think we're good right now.
Okay, well, I'll keep going. We can always go back to some of this later. All right, next topic then. Upland coal ash fill and how it compares to a coal ash slurry impoundment. Folks, it's not the same thing. Laura did a good job of refreshing you on the history of this site. Long before the town acquired title, it was a sand and gravel borrow pit. And then it was backfilled. Someone decided to improve the property, fill whatever gully that resulted from the borrow with construction debris and coal ash. That was a very common practice in the 60s and 70s when this took place. As we mentioned in the fact sheet, coal ash was commonly used, less common now, but still legal to use it as structural fill. I've seen this site referred to as a waste dump, and I do not believe that is an accurate description at all. This is a site that contains structural coal ash fill that was placed there many decades ago. Now, let's talk about coal ash for a minute. And again, I'm leading here, but I've got technical people who know more about this than I do. So you all know, you got this now, it's residuals from burning coal in coal-fired power plants. It's mostly silica or sand, but it includes some fine particles. And so what's the concern with coal ash? Well, if it's uncovered, the fine particles can cause respiratory problems if inhaled. And it also contains naturally occurring heavy metals that are in elevated concentrations can cause health and environmental concerns. Hence, you try to address all human interaction with the coal ash. Would it be easier to redevelop this site if the coal ash was not present? Absolutely, because the cap and contain measures would not be necessary. But Laura, if you'll go to the next slide. But the circumstances that we're facing with this site are not the same as the impoundments at Duke Energy, where millions of gallons of ash slurry was spilled into the Dan River. And I just illustrate this with this aerial view. And I want to tip my hat to our friends at Southern Environmental Law Center. They did some tremendous work toward reducing the risk of such a catastrophic event occurring again from coal ash slurry impoundments near waters, near utility plants. But the risk of coal ash, you get it now, depends upon the location and whether it's covered or not. And the circumstances that we're dealing with and facing with this site simply cannot be conflated with the risk associated with these coal ash slurry impoundments like the one in this picture. Okay, Laura, next slide. So let's talk about the brownfields program for a minute. And this may be redundant for some of you. It's a means to ensure safe reuse over the long term. So it's, the brownfields came in, late 90s. It's to encourage the redevelopment or reuse of, sites that are idle or underutilized because of some environmental condition. So what's the alternative to a brownfields? Well, greenfield, right? We just keep gobbling up sites, raw land. That's sort of the purpose of the brownfields program. It gives incentives for prospective developers like Belmont to come in and repurpose property that has some environmental condition. But it's not redevelopment or remediation. That is a false choice if anyone is still struggling with that. By law, the site has to be made safe for whatever reuse is proposed under the brownfields law. So, it's not a shortcut in terms of addressing environmental issues on a site. It is a requirement that the site be made safe for whatever reuse is proposed for the long term. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. Now, I want to make this point. I mentioned that I've also worked with sites that have been remediated voluntarily outside the brownfields program. If this site was remediated outside brownfields under one of those other programs, the remedy, the approach, the cap and contain that we've discussed so far, with deed restrictions regarding use, would likely end up being the very same, cap and contain. But under those other programs, you would not have the same long-term requirements the brownfields program provides per a brownfields agreement that we're just about to discuss in a minute. I did see there was sort of a late question about, who was going to be parties to the brownfields agreement. The MOU and any EDA will contemplate that the town and Belmont will both be parties to the brownfields agreement. We will work together in negotiating the brownfields agreement. Belmont will take the lead, but we're both involved in that. Both parties will be parties to that agreement, assuming there is any private aspect to the redevelopment. If there is no private aspect to the redevelopment, then Belmont would not need to be a party to the brownfields agreement, but the town would be the only party under that scenario. Okay, next slide, Laura. So I mentioned this, cite the general statute there for you. The property, it's a requirement in seeking a brownfields agreement that the applicants can show to the brownfields officials at DEQ that the property will be suitable for the use specified in the agreement, which fully protects public health and the environment. And there also has to be a public benefit. Let's go to the next slide, Laura. Now, as I mentioned, I know there have been some questions about what protections are in place to ensure over time any reuse of the property remains safe for use, both from a public health and an environmental standpoint. So that's sort of the purpose of this slide. The long-term measures that are in place under the brownfields program. I mentioned before perpetual deed restrictions. I mentioned that it's pretty much a given that there would be a deed restriction that no use of the groundwater on this site. That's very common in brownfields agreements, not a problem in an area with public water supply. The next one is important, that there would be an agreement, and actually it would be one of the recorded deed restrictions, that there's no disturbances of soil on the site unless it's an emergency absent DEQ approval. Now, what I've said so far is not unique to the brownfields program. What I'm about to go into now is unique to that program. Enter a brownfields agreement, binding agreement with DEQ. One of the things it requires is the other parties make annual inspections and certifications to DEQ that the measures put in place to protect public health and the environment remain in place. The brownfields law has a number of what I call reopeners, and these get incorporated into the brownfields agreement. So, DEQ enters a brownfields agreement today. Well, what happens if 10 years from now, 5 years from now, there's new information about a contaminant of concern at the site? Well, that's that's one of the reopeners where DEQ can come and say, okay, we know more about this contaminant. There's more of a risk associated with it than we thought, and can expect some action to address that. The other reopeners is that the risk to public health and the environment is unacceptable due to some change in the use of the property. And finally, if it's there's a previously unreported contaminants or new area of contamination that is found on the site. So what I want to end on this one is those annual inspections reports, the reopeners, those are elements that are unique to the Brownfields program in terms of ensuring that things remain safe on site for the long term. Outside the Brownfields program, there's no requirement that those be in place. So I only have one other topic, and maybe this is another place for me just to stop to see if there's any questions so far.
I think we're good. Go ahead.
Okay, we're on the home stretch. Last topic, and the mayor helped me with this. Memorandum of understanding. Some of us that work in the business world would use the term letter of intent. It's a document that parties enter into in advance of a binding agreement. It sort of frames the anticipated terms of a future agreement if they get that far. It makes it easier once you get to the point that you're trying to write a binding agreement, which in this case would be an economic development agreement with Belmont-Sayre. The memorandum of understanding, if it is executed, would basically start the local permitting process with an actual redevelopment concept plan. So it would launch us into a two-phase thing over the short term. Dual tracking. One is start your normal process for concept review. And the other is at the same time, begin joint negotiations with the Brownfields group at DEQ. Now, the memorandum of understanding identifies a preferred project of one, build the new center for the town, and some private development. But the MOU also says, okay, that's plan A. If that is not approved through the conditional zoning process, then plan B is build the municipal center and not have any private development. As to the private development, the MOU says the preferred approach is primarily, if not wholly, multifamily residential family housing. But whatever private use, if any, is ultimately allowed on this site will have to be approved through your conditional zoning process. So as we sit here today, we're 18 to 24 months from the point where the conditional zoning permit would be issued for this site. So quite a ways away from that. So the last slide I've got is sort of the schedule. There's a commitment to a public information meeting regarding the MOU. And then assuming the MOU is approved, the next two things are what I've already mentioned, dual tracking, begin the concept review, go through the concept review process, and then the Brownfields discussion. And assuming at that point that Belmont is willing to continue into an agreement and that the town is willing, then the economic development agreement would be entered. That's a binding agreement. And it would be after that that we get more serious and there would be an application for conditional zoning, go through your normal process on that application. And at the same time, we would submit well, Belmont would pay the fee, and then we would begin negotiating a brownfields agreement. Laura, do you want me to go ahead and address the question about potential purchase price for any land that's conveyed to Belmont for private?
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. We addressed this in the memorandum of understanding. The idea is, okay, let's get through the concept review. Let's get all the feedback that you get from concept review. And then if it's still a go with a private development aspect to redeveloping the property, in the economic development agreement, the parties would agree to how much land, how much acreage would be conveyed to Belmont for private development, and what the dimensions of that acreage would be, and what the price per that acreage would be. It is not contemplated that the town will convey any dirt to Belmont for what might be called a nominal fee. What we've done in the MOU is we've agreed, okay, when we get to that point where we've got to negotiate a purchase price per acre, and again, at this point, we don't know where that dirt is or how much dirt it is, but we'll give consideration at that point to, one, the market value of the land unimpaired, two, the site-wide development cost and the allocation of those costs between the parties, three, the value of brownfields tax credits that will accrue to Belmont because there are tax incentives for them to build private infrastructure on the property. Four, the present value of future property taxes to the town from a private aspect to use of the property. And then finally, the benefits to the community. So, we've identified the basis at which we would arrive at a purchase price for whatever dirt is sold for private development. When we get to that point, we will not have gone through conditional zoning at that point. And therefore, what we will do with that purchase price is we will make some assumptions. If the concept plan at that point is still some multifamily residential, we'll make some assumptions about the number of units that will be approved. We'll make some assumptions about what the ultimate affordable housing requirements will be. And if through the conditional zoning process, the council decides, well, we want more affordable housing than what that assumption was, or we're not going to give you as many units as what was contemplated, then we'll make an adjustment at that point in the purchase price to account for those changes. That might be more detail than you need, but I hope it illustrates, no, we're not selling dirt for a nominal value. We want this to be, speaking for myself, and having done projects like this, it needs to be a win-win for both parties. But we've contemplated, we've gone into quite a detail about how that purchase price will be determined. So I think that's it, Laura.
Thank you. Okay. I'm open it up for clarifying questions, and then we can come back for discussion. Amy Ryan?
Thank you very much. Thanks for the thorough presentation, Mr. Johnson. I appreciate that. So looking kind of high level, based on you said 30 years of experience, do you feel like the town has hired the right environmental consultants, conducted the right reviews, and asked the right questions up to this point, that we can feel confident that it's appropriate to move into this next non-binding phase?
I absolutely do. I think Steve Hart's one of the best environmental consultants in the state. I'm the one that recommended him for this. So I do. If anything, you guys have, if anything, you could be accused of overstudying it, and but you've been cautious, and I think the mayor set the right tone. I would agree with that tone. After 8 years, it's time to, if there is a consensus, to take the next step and start the conceptual review with an actual redevelopment plan in front of you. No more hypotheticals.
Okay, so can I take that to mean that you don't feel like there's anything missing at this point, that we've done what we need to do?
No.
Great. And let's see, and we talk about our brownfield program. I don't know how the North Carolina program relates to the safety standards that are national or used by other states. Are we kind of on a par with everybody?
All right, that's a Steve question. Steve?
Get off mute, make sure I'm off mute. Yep. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, in general, EPA kind of sets the goals and what's an acceptable risk level in some of their regulations, and those are, carried down into the state level. So DEQ basically follows, in terms of acceptable risk levels and what levels of contaminants are acceptable, that kind of thing, are all derived from EPA and their guidance that they put out in regulation. So from that standpoint, yes, we're, North Carolina is very much on par with what other states are doing and what EPA is doing. I would say for the most part, North Carolina brownfields program is very conservative in terms of how they look at sites and making sure that these are being done to make sure that the sites are safe for their intended use, future use. And so I would say from that aspect, the state of North Carolina is probably a little more conservative in terms of how they look at sites and the amount of investigation that they require, monitoring over long-term, that kind of thing. There are states, for example, in South Carolina, where kind of this long-term monitoring and evaluation, there's an annual report, but in terms of reopeners and that kind of thing, that doesn't occur. And so I think, North Carolina's program is very good, but it's also, very much intended to be protective of human health and the environment, because they don't, they want to make sure some of these sites don't, come back on the radar as something that may have occurred. And so I have had cases where, these reopeners have occurred. They're not something that's just kind of out there in the statute, but there are cases where we have had reopeners occur, whether a new information has come up about a contaminant, or some new information has come up about contamination that might be migrating to the site from somewhere else. And the brownfields program, even after the agreement's been completed, has asked for for additional assessment and evaluation to be done to make sure that folks that are living there or working there are protected in the long term.
Great, thank you. And I've got one more, little bit more specific question. So we have this bank, which is an issue where there's some exposure right now, and I know we have a cap and cover plan for that. If that failed, do we know who would take care of that, or would that be negotiated as part of the EDA?
So are you asking what would happen if the retaining wall failed?
Well, we've got the retaining wall, or what if there were a catastrophic hurricane comes in and wipes the fill off, or just, I think somebody mentioned, I think Mr. Johnson mentioned earlier, if we have an act of God and something happens to that, who would have responsibility for taking care of that? And I guess too, what if it's not us, how are we guaranteed that will be taken care of and done correctly?
That is something that we can address in the economic development agreement between the town and Belmont. Um, one factor that we'll need that's undetermined at this point is, so this retaining walls, we know there's going to be a retaining wall. What we don't know yet is whether that retaining wall is going to be on private property or on public property. Well, obviously, if it's on public property, then your control over it and your concern over this probably goes down. And your question may be more, okay, well, what if it's on private property, and what contractual obligations can be put in place to make sure that appropriate remediation is done if there is some catastrophic event. And that is something that we can address by contract. I would also add that the construction and the maintenance of that retaining wall is going to be a requirement in a brownfields agreement. We all know that. So that's another layer of protection, regardless of who owns the land. The state of North Carolina, DEQ, will have the ability under the brownfields agreement to make sure that any remediation takes place if there's such an event.
Great, thank you very much.
Adams and Jess?
Yeah, I just had a few questions, mostly for Mr. Johnson, and then maybe one for you, Mr. Hart. So now, Mr. Johnson, I know when you were saying that academic questions didn't matter, you weren't thinking that you were talking to folks in the home of the greatest public university in the nation, and indeed the first one. So I know that you just misspoke about that question. So, but anyway, so my first question is for you. My understanding is Poynter and Spruill has offices in Charlotte, Raleigh, Rocky Mount, and Southern Pines. So where do you live?
Raleigh.
Raleigh. Okay, thank you. And you mentioned in your remarks that you didn't consider this to be a coal ash dump, but I'm wondering, what's your understanding of how the coal ash got there?
Well, let's see. I don't know that we have done any investigation to determine how it specifically got to this site. I know there's some people on the call who could,
Well, I know you want me to refresh your memory. We've talked about this before. Is that some of it got the working theory is it came from the UNC coal plant.
It had to come from some coal-fired power plant.
Right. Yeah. And so it came here, I assume, in a dump truck, and then somebody dumped it there. Would that be correct?
Is this a deposition? I don't know.
I'm just asking. You were the one who brought up that this is not, you did not.
Could have been horse and cart. I don't know.
Okay. Well, anyway, it sounds to me like it got dumped there, so that's what I call it. And then the final question I have for you.
But it's not a waste. That's the point, sir. It was not a waste. Legally speaking, it was not classified as a waste.
Will we allow it to happen today?
Yes. Now there are, protections in place, but it is still legal under certain circumstances, even under, law put in place in North Carolina in 2014, to use coal ash for structural fill. Now over
the Bowling Creek.
We're not talking about a scenario where someone is suggesting that we're going to bring more coal ash to this site.
I'm not. I'm just
know that.
Okay. Well, I got one final question for you. So, you and I are attorneys, and this is an easy one for anyone who's been a lawyer. Have you ever had a client who's made a bad mistake?
I've had clients that, no, it's never happened.
Okay. Well, I'll take that as a yes. We represent the Angels. Now, Mr. Hart, I just have one quick question for you. So my understanding is that Hart and Hickman, your company, has a Charlotte headquarters and a Raleigh office. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then where do you live?
I live in Charlotte.
Charlotte. Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, Jess? Then Michael?
Yeah, thank you. So when you, Mr. Johnson, when you were talking about how we might be accused of overdoing it on the studies that we've done, or that it seems reasonable what we've done. What in your experience has been the amount of study done before one would get to the stage that we're talking about now, in terms of signing the MOU?
I think my main point goes to the fact that typically before you do any risk assessment, you have an actual redevelopment plan in place. It's kind of a cart and horse comment. And I'm mainly referring to the risk assessment that was done on the upland portion last fall. It's unusual. Normally you have an actual redevelopment plan. This is what I propose to do with the site, which would be potentially the next step here. Now let's do a risk assessment to see what the risk is associated with that. You don't do the risk assessment and say, well, under this scenario, here's the risk. Under these scenarios, here's the risk. That was my.
Yeah. No, I understand. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm understanding is that that we've done the studies based on current conditions, and that anything that we would see from here on out would be, then we could evaluate it and look at, we could have all our experts come in, we could ensure, we could have Steve and his team come back, and we could have them look at whatever the actual proposal is and make sure that, there's no risk, that there's no places where things would be uncovered or uncapped, that basically we've done the assessment based on current conditions where nothing, besides the remediation that we've done, that
Right.
there hasn't been any, capping, that it's all based on what it looks like now, not what it would be in the future.
Right. I mean, the next step is to have an actual concept plan in front of everyone. Goes through your concept review. We take that to the Brownfields group at DEQ, and we start to have a conversation with them. You keep Steve and his crowd in your corner. The concept plan is produced by Belmont, but you've got Steve and his crowd in your corner to review it and make comments, and to basically consider the integrity of what they are, what they're proposing. Does that answer?
So it wouldn't
your
just be brownfields. It wouldn't even just be the brownfields program that would be evaluating it, although it helps to understand that it's a pretty conservative program, that it's in line with other programs, but it wouldn't even just be the brownfields program officers that would be reviewing the concept plan. Is that fair?
That's right. I would recommend you keep Steve in your corner,
Okay.
reviewing.
And so based on what was found, and we did do a lot of studies. So, and again, I think the thing we've learned during COVID for sure is don't do your own research, get experts, that we don't need people doing their own research about anything that they are not an expert in. So what was found on the current conditions, if you could just summarize it for folks who might be new to the conversation.
From that last risk assessment. Okay.
Yes.
All right, Steve, you want to take that one?
And I don't mean in detail, but generally, like, my understanding is it's safe now.
So under the current conditions, with regard to users of the trail, we've looked at, we actually, there was some information about how long people spend on the trail. There was a survey taken. So we have information about how often people frequent the trail, how long they stay. So under the current conditions, having done the removal that we did in the interim action, the trail is safe for users of the trail. The site is also safe under current conditions for use by people visiting the police headquarters. So people that work there, people that do maintenance, that kind of thing. The scenario where there was an unacceptable risk was if in the current conditions of the site was changed to residential use. Let's say you just took the police headquarters building and decided we're going to let apartments be there. And there were some areas that had exposed soil where there were one area in the upland portion of the site and several areas on the embankment where there is some exposed coal ash, although we have put some vegetation on it and some erosion control measures, but where they would pose over a lifetime, not a short-term exposure, but a long-term exposure, which is 26 years for someone to live there during their childhood, as well as adult. There could be an unacceptable risk. Without doing anything, if the site was just changed to residential use, there could be an unacceptable risk, in which case you would want to address those soil or exposed coal ash. If you just change it.
You just said someone would have to live there for 26 years for it to be an unacceptable risk. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so the calculations assume that a person is exposed to soil for 26 years, 6 years as a child. I'm sorry, I think it's 10 years as a child, and then 16 years as an adult or something like that. You know, so the exposures we're talking about here are long-term exposures. And
so even if there was a failure, which sounds unlikely, that would mean you'd have a really short-term exposure, which isn't the risk anyway. Is that fair?
That's correct. Yeah, and they're based upon lifetime accumulation over a lifetime too. So
right.
They assume somebody's going to live 70 years, and they assume that a child eats 200 milligrams of soil a day, an adult would consume 100 milligrams of soil a day. So they're very conservative assumptions, standard assumptions that EPA uses. So those are the same ones that EQ uses and that we use as well.
And so basically anything that would come forward in a concept plan would be making it safer, because it would be paving, capping, putting a building. So we should expect that anything that would come in the concept plan, we'd be better off than we are in current state. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, yes. So you would be capping these areas that we're talking about where there might be some exposure. You would also be reducing infiltration of rainwater into the ground, which could lead to some groundwater contamination, even though we haven't found any significant now. So all those would reduce potential exposure risks and concerns.
Thank you.
Redevelopment plan.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
Michael?
So Jess covered most of what I wanted to talk about. Just a couple of quick questions. One, going back to the scenario wherein the coal ash is excavated and trucked 40 or more miles to basically make it someone else's problem. Getting into that, so let's say that was something, for whatever reason, that was decided to be done. What then who gets that risk? Who protects, you bring all this coal ash somewhere else, how are those folks then protected? And what kinds of communities are these, is coal, these kinds of substances typically brought to? And are you basically just, saying, okay, well, Chapel Hill is just offloading its risk to some other poor community?
I'll start this and then someone can fill in. I think under that scenario, Mr. Parker, the coal ash fill, and this will be true. I did mention there will be some amount that will have to be excavated and shipped and properly disposed of off site. So they would be taken not just to somebody else's unlined property, but would be taken to a permitted landfill that's permitted to accept it.
Yeah, so they would go to a lined, permitted landfill, like operated by Waste Management or Republic Services. I know there was some evaluation done before the material that was removed from along in the interim remedial measures. What was the landfill that would pose the least concern from a community where the landfill is, you know, in terms of environmental justice concerns or those kind of things. And I believe the landfill in Rougemont was selected, if I'm not mistaken, as the one that, you know, probably posed the least amount of concerns from another community, transferring it to another community standpoint. But I mean, those are line landfills. There would be, you know, obviously putting your waste in landfill with many other people that have put their waste there as well. So, you know, I do know, I think, you know, obviously there's always concerns, you know, with potential exposure if, you know, the landfill operator goes bankrupt. Keith's talk about that, but, you know, those are fairly unlikely, you know, and they do have closure bonds and that kind of thing that the landfills have to have. So.
Okay, thanks. And just one last point, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but so just to put it in very simple terms, the remediation that is proposed for this site, the cap and contain, the end goal of that isn't that there would be minimal human exposure or a lifetime human exposure, but that there would be zero exposure to people. Is that a fairly concise way of saying it? That after this is all done, there will be no, even for people, whatever use that's put to, nobody will be exposed to coal ash.
Absent some catastrophic event, like a 500-year storm, a rogue utility contractor, somebody's going to have to bring a piece of equipment in on the site. I mean, you know, we're not talking about a scenario where a child digs a 5-foot hole, but, you know, Mr. Parker, with that, you know, caveat that, you know, there are those types of very unlikely scenarios that we just can't, you know, discount. So, you know, we that's why we said, you know, the cap and contain is to address any potential exposure to the coal ash.
And presumably, if one of these catastrophic events happened, again, they're fixable. And
That's
so,
right.
you know, if the dirt got washed away, we would put down more dirt.
Right. Ms. Anderson touched on that. I mean, it's not
it's not like if you're exposed, you know, if there's exposure for 3 days.
Right. You got it.
They're fixable.
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Harris?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Mr. Johnson, for your presentation.
Mhm.
Just want to piggyback a little bit off of the conversation and the way that it was going in terms of responsibility and who's held responsible. From my understanding, that part of this underwriting is insurance, to ensure that there are reserves maintained to address any kinds of repairs that need to be done. Could you just speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah. So in the MOU structure that we have right now, there is there's a requirement that during the course of the relationship that Belmont Sayre would maintain minimum levels of insurance, commercial general liability coverage with very customary limits. We're not at this point, and that's sort of typical of what you would put in any type of contract that the town enters with another vendor. So there's nothing unusual about those. Those are sort of boilerplate customary requirements. Beyond that, I don't know that, we're not expecting them to post a bond or have any other type of insurance besides, what I just described.
What I'm just trying to get at is there will be funds available. So Belmont, as it pertains to responsibility and who holds responsibility, that the insurance is there to ensure that there are funds to ensure that the maintenance and upkeep and safety is in place for repairs that may need to be done over the course of this property.
That is something that we can try to negotiate to put into the economic development agreement.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring this back to council members for discussion. If you do not have to make comments, but if you are ready to move forward with a MOU, or you're not willing to move forward with an MOU at this point, if you'll just say so. Those of you who don't wish to make comments this evening, I'll ask for a thumbs up and down out of the rest of you. So we will start off that way. Amy, then Jess, then Adam.
Yeah, I feel like we've hired the right consultants. We've spent 8 years looking at the technical information. I think we're at a state where we can't get more information about what's safe to do and how we can proceed unless we get the MOU and start and actually get a concept plan. So I'm in favor of moving forward.
Jess, then Adam.
I agree. I'm really glad we've been so cautious. I think we as a council and our community really want us to be, really thorough and maybe go beyond what other communities might have chosen to do. And that would have been reasonable as well. But I'm very thankful that our staff has taken us through this process and has gotten us the additional information that I think we need to feel confident that we have, that we're keeping our community safe. I think we've had long discussions on AstroTurf in my time on council. We want to do the right thing and I wanted the cork. I didn't want the one that it could possibly be dangerous, so I get it. I understand. We don't ever want to, we think about our own kids and we don't want anybody's kids to be exposed to anything dangerous. And so I think I feel satisfied that we've gone beyond, and I'm really thankful to our consultants and our staff for helping us get to this place where we have everything we need and we understand it as non-experts. So I very much support just moving to the next step where then we can evaluate again and make sure that that whatever comes forward is also safe.
Adam.
Well, I unfortunately have to disagree with my two fellow council members so far as much as I respect their opinions. This MOU is moving us towards building residential housing on this coal ash dump, and I think that's a mistake. And I understand that there's a lot more process ahead, but I kind of think of this. I used to take my kids to the Battleship North Carolina, and they have the wheel on the bridge of the battleship. It's kind of like moving one of those battleships. You're turning the wheel when you sign that MOU, and it's going to be hard to move that battleship away from that direction of building housing. And I think the reason that I'm so disturbed by this is really that we as politicians are often very good at recommending a course of action for other people, but sometimes not so good at also being willing to take that course of action. And now, with due respect to Mr. Johnson and Mr. Hart, they are well respected in their fields and have done a great job at analyzing the risks and the decision we have to make. But they do not live here, and they are not planning to move their families or onto this, as a residential site. They're not planning to move onto this coal ash dump. I would certainly not plan to move my family and my kids and reside on top of this coal ash dump. And my suspicion is that, I don't know, but that most people on this call would not be willing to move their kids onto this coal ash dump. I mean, everybody has to, make that decision for themselves, obviously. But for me, if I am not willing to do that, then I don't think that we should be willing to ask other residents of the town to do that. So I am a firm no.
Michael?
Well, to address Adam's point, my child is a little bit old to be told where to live. She's 35, so she'll make her own decisions on those things. But certainly, and I'm pretty happy where I'm living now, but if somebody builds something better there, I'd move. Based on all that I have heard, based on everything that I've read, and we had, I don't want to say that this has been overstudied, but it has sure been studied. And at some point, we are, have to make rational decisions based on the best information that we can possibly get. Nothing in this life is risk-free. And that's not to say that I'm looking to impose risk on Chapel Hill. We've heard our team say that there will be no exposure. We're not debating, unlike certain circumstances, whether or not the level of exposure is safe. We are remediating this so there will be no exposure. I don't happen to know what's under Greenbridge, but it could be something. I don't know what, none of us know what's under our houses. We know that some places in this town have radon problems. And those are just the facts of life. But we are going above and beyond. The folks who find, if this is developed for residential, the folks who live there will have zero exposure to coal ash products, the same way that any of the rest of us in this town will have presumably, we don't know that for a fact, have zero exposure to coal ash. So I think that trying to paint this as something that we're telling people or asking people to do that, which we would not do ourselves, I don't think is really helpful. And I feel completely comfortable that we can and will, both in the short and in the long term, continue to make this a safe site with, as our team has told us, not low levels, not safe levels, but zero levels of coal ash exposure.
Okay. Any other council members wanting to make comments, or do you want to just do a thumbs up?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to, and I'm sorry for the going out of turn. I just wanted to clarify that what I'm understanding very clearly is this is not a coal ash dump. And so calling it a coal ash dump is just inaccurate. Is that, am I missing something?
I think we've been told that it's not a coal ash dump. It's got coal ash fill in it, but it's not a coal ash dump.
And those are very different things. And the things we see around the state that are scary and terrible, that's not what this is.
Okay. Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I just will say that I agree with, especially with what Michael has said. Also, Jess and Amy, we have been studying this for 8 years with a lot of caution and a lot of thoroughness and a lot of testing. And, with COVID, we've heard over and over, listen to the science. And that's what we're doing. I think reacting emotionally to this is not helpful, and we will continue to follow the science as we move forward. And I think we've also studied the best site for the police station and the future, the MSC building. And I think this is a really good location, and we will, every step of the way, we've made sure whatever we decide is going to be safe. And I know we will continue to do that. Our staff and consultants have been really thorough. And, you know, we have studied this, and I'm really ready to move forward so that we can get to that next step of making good decisions. So
Your audio is breaking up quite a bit. Sorry, but I think we heard you. We're good. Okay.
You get the point.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you. Camille?
Thanks. What we're looking at tonight is a decision of what's the next right step. Are we going to move forward with this MOU, or are we going to abandon this project? I don't think we have sufficient information to abandon this project. There is enough merit for us to look further. And as to the question of would we live there, I will tell my esteemed colleague that I haven't had the privileges that you've had of choosing always where to live. But I do think deeply about where I live and where I put those who are in my care, where they live. And right now, serving as a council member alongside you, I take that very seriously, as do the rest of our colleagues. I have no doubt. So to level that accusation, I would say is extremely unfair. So I have thought about this. Would I live there? And I actually rent. Now, this will be a rental property. It is something that I'm considering. It will be on a major transit route. It will be monitored much more heavily than many of our properties across this town. It is town property. So the next right step for me, and I would be willing to vote for this, is to move forward with this MOU, because what I have heard is nothing that we should not. This is not something to abandon. Thank you.
Thank you. Paris?
Thank you, Camille. Thanks for all the comments. And I just want to say that we have a responsibility in this position that we hold, that we are using the right language. This is not a coal ash dump. And we have a responsibility to represent this property correctly. And like Camille, I haven't always had the choice of where I live either. I have family members right now who are trying to move back to their ancestral home of Chapel Hill, and they can't afford to do so. So I want to commend previous council as well as our staff for the due diligence that has been done in studying this so that we can get to this point. I want the community to know that we are taking this very seriously. The studies that have been done are proof of that. The investment of time has been proof of that as well. So we're not just moving into this willy-nilly. I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Ty, did you want to add a comment?
I mean, might as well. So, you know, I definitely have no kids, any that I know of, and I'm probably old enough to be my colleague's kid. But I will also echo Councilmember Barry's comments. I think it's very important for us to acknowledge, even in the last place that I rented, there was mold. Every time it rained, it flooded. I'm talking multiple inches of water inside the unit. There are families in our community who live in much worse conditions today because they have no other options. So I will always be supportive of building quality, safe housing options for those folk in our town. And like my colleagues have said, this is not committing us to any path, any choices, and is only the next step in exploring those possibilities for our community. And I think I am wildly supportive of that.
Thank you. I'll just add my own comments and then wrap us up here. I appreciate all the work that's gone into studying the site to helping us with this big decision. I do know that we've had concerns about the site as it is. Our police station is not in good shape. They've been working there on that site with all the exposures, and we haven't had an incident so far that we're aware of. I was one of the reasons that we decided to stop the Greenway production and scoop up the coal ash that was near the trail so that we could learn more about what was actually involved. And I was pleased with that work as well. I do believe that going to the next step at this point so that we can get information back from DEQ, that we can look at a plan. We desperately need housing. All these safety protocols that are put into place, and I was too thinking about the places in town that flood. We've got public housing in some flood zone areas, that there are opportunities here for people to live in a great location, right on a greenway, right on a transit corridor, a walking distance to downtown, walking distance to the YMCA, all kinds of places. I think there's opportunity here, but I want to see the next step. I want to see what comes back with a concept plan. I want to see what comes back from DEQ. We've all learned a lot, and it's taken so long that I told you we've crossed across 3 different iterations of council. And I would say that every time we've done that, there's been this consensus to keep moving forward to find out what we can find out. So this will come back to council members at a regular meeting for a vote to move forward or not with an MOU. Unless anyone has any final comments that weren't covered already, we have about a few minutes left for questions. If there's someone wishing to ask a question at this point from the audience. Oh, okay. Adam, you had something first?
Yeah, I just wanted to take 30 seconds. I mean, I certainly did not mean to, speak for anyone else on this council. So I would say, please forgive me for, implying that at all. I certainly didn't mean to do that. And really the question for me is not, should we move forward with the mitigation that all the consultants have done? Sure. And we're talking about offices. We're talking about, redoing the municipal, offices there too, and maybe even doing retail. And so the question is not, do we move all the coal ash or not? That I think is a straw man. I think the question is, do we move forward on this retail? And I could support the MOU if we didn't have the emphasis on saying we're moving forward towards residential. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. All right. If there's anyone in the attendee list that has a question, if you would use the raise your hand function. I don't think we have anybody on the phone function. Not seeing anybody. This will be coming back to a regular council meeting. Okay. Well then, that was what we had on our agenda tonight. We appreciate our experts coming to share with us more information and for answering the questions. We appreciate all the hard work that Laura Selmer has done. I know she's learned quite a bit over the time. And it was nice to have this be our only item to discuss in depth so we understood fully. And it's always helpful when council members get their questions in ahead of time. So thank you for all of you who did that as well. And you will see this on an agenda. I'm not sure exactly when yet, but we will see how that shakes out. And again, an MOU, just a reminder, is a non-binding agreement. And we can put things in there so there'll be some discussion about what goes into the MOU. And it is not the EDA, the Economic Development Agreement, and it is not an approval for zoning or a guarantee of any entitlement. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear with that. And with that being said, we'll see you on Friday morning at 8 a.m.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you.